This is number 18, first revision of my thought pieces on human nature and why we so oftentimes do the counterproductive things that we do. It's us versus them. Why are we so instinctively tribal? One of what I believe are the strangest tribes that we will join is the supporters of populist dictators. They have been manipulating this easy button in our brains forever. They've dominated human history, and they're everywhere around the world today. We seem to love them. Why? This particular material I've been working on for about 10 years. This one is long, like my last one, number 17, not unlike a Joe Rogan podcast. I hope you can last all the way through, because I believe this is a moment in human history, the year 2020, through the coronavirus crisis, that we need to be thinking about narcissistic psychopathology and how it affects our politics around the world. Please bear with the volume changes. What makes Homo sapiens unique? We have these accidentally large brains. And over time, through evolution, those brains got bigger and bigger and more complex and led to our uniquely human consciousness. And that uniquely human consciousness gave us a capacity for complex emotions, like love, for example. Versus other species, we developed a love of self, our ego, as well as a love of others, empathy for others, that is equally highly developed. And what those types of love led to was much greater social cooperation, which led to better tribal solidarity. And for humans, the so-called naked ape, we are largely defenseless outside of our brain power and dexterity. And so social cooperation and tribal solidarity gave us the protection we needed in tribal groups and social groups to be able to protect each other and protect ourselves. Humans have had to learn how to balance individual versus societal interests, self-interest versus all the values that society as a whole finds valuable: honor, virtue, justice, fairness, equality, and integrity. Over our long history of evolution, what type of politics is it that got wired into our brains that make us happiest, that make us function best? Let's face it, effective management of a tight social group requires, number 1, cooperation, trust, loyalty, and good communication. 2, sharing, generosity, empathy, and sacrifice. 3, aggressive defense of the group against threats. 4, pragmatism. The weak get left behind or put down, sad but true. Unwavering focus on what's best for the entire group. Exile or elimination of self-centered individuals. Almost 7 million years of evolution made us into egalitarians. Even in the chimps, male chimps will gang up and kill a tyrant chimp. So clearly this is something that goes way back in our genetic history. The way we evolved to survive best was to balance these two sides of the equation, ego versus empathy. Let's go back in history and figure out what was up with egalitarian hunter-gatherer tribes. What have the anthropologists figured out about what cultural behaviors maintain the balance? Number 1, females must be totally equal contributors. Number 2, children bring each other up in the tribal creche without interference or discipline from parents. 3, adult social play identifies capabilities and promotes self-handicapping, reducing dominance and building trust. Practice of reverse domination prevents narcissistic psychopaths from rising up to dictatorship. What they do is ridicule egoists on a daily basis, and if they can't get them under control, they exile them, and if they can't do that, they kill them. Our brain wiring also came with some intractable human tendencies, and we see this all around the world. The bell curve of voter tendencies looks like this. We've got conservatives on the left in this particular one. I know I should have put it the other way around. And progressive is on the right. The people who tend to vote conservative, based on emotions, not based on any particularly deep thinking they've done or reading or anything else, come in at about 30%. They are hardwired for conservatism. They cannot shake that. And I don't care what kind of conservative politician or religious leader tries to convince you that their very special population is not like the rest of the world's human population. It's bullshit. There are just as many gays, lesbians, conservatives and progressives, and narcissistic psychopaths and sociopathic criminals everywhere in the world. It's just the way humans are wired. The same goes for about 30% on the progressive side, the blue side. They are hardwired for feeling this way, and no amount of rationale from very good conservative theorizing will shift their point of view. In the middle, we have the swing voters, and these are the people who actually determine all democratic votes in truly democratic countries. They are open-minded and see value in policies from both sides of the political spectrum. I believe that if we look at IQ within these populations, that the majority of the people who are on the hardwired conservative side tend to be average or below average in IQ, which is not true of only the conservative side, it's also true on the progressive side. But here I've reversed the bell curve. Take a look at the colors. The large volume of the 30% of hardwired progressives are also a little above average IQ to below average IQ. In the middle is where you find the really clever people. They are open-minded, they can take in a great deal of data and analyze it in their brains and evaluate and come up with programs and ideas, and with their open minds and their higher IQs, they can choose policies that are going to be best for the majority of their fellow citizens. If we look at the situation in America and look back in history to this character, we know that he was a liar, liar, pants on fire when he said, "I am not a crook." And yet, after he quit office because he was clearly a crook, fully 29% of Americans still said they supported him and that he was a great guy. That same 29% makes up Trump's base many decades later. And even more people whose hardwired tendency is right-leaning approve of what Donald Trump claims to have been doing. Now let's recognize that it's not Donald, it's all the Republican senators who are making everything happen. Donald does a lot of golfing and watching TV. And tweeting, let's not forget the tweeting. However, what is clear about this right-leaning side of the American electorate is that they aren't voting for the candidate. They don't care who the candidate is. It's their wiring that is doing the voting. Let's think about how deep this goes in the wiring of Homo sapiens' brains. When it comes to religion, it is intuition that informs religion. When we look at the sun rising in the east and setting in the west, ancient humans believed that there must be some chariot pulling it through the sky. Murder is bad, and so human beings came up with 10 commandments in the Christian tradition to regulate our worst instincts. But what has always been there at the base of our behavior, due to self-preservation, is tribalism, our instinct to behave in a way that keeps us in a tribe and therefore protects us and protects our genetic copies, our children, our families. While it is science that informs truth, innovation, change, adaptation, all of those are only possible because of Homo sapiens' advanced intellect, our improved IQ. The upper part of this chart speaks to what is at the very core of human nature. Conservatism, the idea that we should be cautious about change and fixing things that ain't broke. Whereas the lower part of this chart speaks to progressivism, the fact that humans, if we were not able to adapt, never would have made it. Progressivism is what drives us forward, while conservatism wants to pull us back. Political correctness has led us to make a lot of mistakes, but this is really the biggest and most destructive one that we've ever come up with. It is the idea that we can no longer talk about IQ. Banning the recognition of high IQ empowers stupidity. It puts the Dunning-Kruger effect on steroids. Highly intelligent people, as they learn more and more, become convinced that they don't know as much as they should and that they are therefore not as smart. And it has stupid people hanging out with other stupid people, getting their views reinforced and thinking that they're absolutely brilliant. When you add to that hard wiring, whether right or left, you get bumper sticker solutions. Things like open borders on the left, build a wall on the right. And then who gets voted in? The best manipulators, the populists. And let's face it, we love leaders who assure us that we're very special. We love leaders that tell us we're the chosen people, whether they are religious leaders or populist autocratic dictators. When we are assured we're the chosen people, we will go to war. If we're told that we, the chosen ones, deserve the riches that the people not of our tribe have, we'll attack them and take their riches from them. The more different those other people look, the more we believe it. The more we are assured that they are less sophisticated than our culture, the more they deserve to be enslaved. The more that one loud guy shouts all of the above, the more excited we are to be members of his team. As the brilliant and seminal research work and analysis that Professor Jonathan Haidt has illustrated, we are actually wired to chant. Humans love to chant and cheer together. We seek out public gatherings, especially those with music. Military marching or dancing in a circle is tremendously gratifying to us. It's part of our brain wiring. The reward center in our brain gives us little bursts of hormones when we participate in these things. For some people, cheering for an autocratic dictator, who, mind you, are always narcissistic psychopaths. There's no such thing as an autocratic dictator who is not a narcissistic psychopath, is a real thrill. They'll go out of their way, spend money to go to these rallies and cheer for these guys. The magical presence of that autocratic dictator feeds their need to be a part of a tribe that will vanquish its enemies. So who is the ideal populist Politico? He's the guy with zero empathy for the suffering of others. That gives him superhuman power over others because he just doesn't feel anything. The ideal populist has no shame, no guilt, no remorse. And that way, failure is no deterrent to them. They're never going to quit due to any of those feelings. They are expert at extracting what people fear the most and replaying it to them. They lie to manipulate non-stop, and they see truth in all conspiracy theories. They are superb actors when it comes to acting like they feel morals and emotions, but they don't. They actually have no beliefs whatsoever. They have absolute conviction that they are very special and always right. They have a desperate need for adulation, for adoration, for loyalty. And they have a bottomless desire for hoarding wealth and power. They have a relentless drive to attain number 7 and 8. And they have a total inability to recognize that they have issues and need to change. And let's think about what makes narcissistic psychopaths special. Oh, guess what? Every single one of those 10 points define narcissistic psychopaths. Narcissistic psychopaths are poison to democracies. Yes, they're only 1% of the population, but they have 100% self-interest. They have no interest in all those other things that society as a whole values. What else sets narcissistic psychopaths apart? They love other autocratic totalitarians. They perceive themselves to be outstanding deal makers. Sex is both fun and domination, so they have lots of wives. In historical times, they had harems and sex slaves. They are extremely poor judges of character due to the fact that they have zero empathy. They cannot read other people. Highly talented, virtuous new hires run away quickly from them as they figure out what they're all about, leaving them with only scoundrels and crooks as cronies. And these get beheaded for disloyalty or as scapegoats. Paranoia makes them hypervigilant to threats, whether they're real or perceived. Family members are their closest confidants. Why? They're totally reliant on the dictator for wealth, parental love, and safety. They can't go anywhere else. And because they are kin, the narcissistic psychopath keeps them around. And let's face it, it's a safety issue because when the dictator gets deposed, the immediate family of the dictator doesn't do so well. But also that narcissistic psychopathology demands absolute control of all family members, absolute fealty. He rules them with an iron fist, and the ultimate punishment for them is banishment from the family, from his little tribe. Recent work with psychopaths seems to prove that they are at the extreme end of the sociopathology spectrum. They're a more extreme version. Sociopaths have some empathy. They understand the rules of society. They can distinguish right from wrong, but they impulsively break the rules anyway, and they averaged about 1 to 2% of the population. Psychopaths do not feel empathy at all, so they cannot tell right from wrong, and they come out at about 1% of our population worldwide. Narcissism, it should be noted, is integral to psychopathology. You don't really have psychopathology without narcissism. And it's not in the DSM, psychiatrists, psychologists, I've never heard them talk about it. However, I believe it to be true. And that is that all disorders fall on a spectrum. It is not either or. It's not just about the people who score very high on the checklists for diagnosing these disorders. Whether you are borderline personality disordered or a narcissistic psychopath, there is a checklist that the experts use to assess whether or not you are diagnosable. But in human society, 68% of people in the dark blue area in the middle are average. And when you give them these tests, I believe that you'll find that most of them will say, yeah, number 6 on the list, that's kind of like me. So you end up with only the extreme people who answer at the 90 to 100% level, but everybody is somewhere on that spectrum. And you have a few people on the left side of this bell curve, out of one of those scale between 0 and 5. How much do you feel that this is in agreement with the way you think? They will say 0 on most of the things. If we look at the sociopathology spectrum, the score there is on the PCLR, which is the Psychopathology Checklist, revised diagnostic tool. And we look at those people who are diagnosable. We've got sociopaths coming in around the 78 to 85% score rate. And they, if you look at the volume at the bottom, the orange and blue sections, they score maybe 1 to 2% of the total volume of people in the population. Next, we've got psychopaths coming in at about 1% of the entire population, scoring higher up on the scale. And at the very, very end of the scale, you've got serial killers at about 0.1%. That's like 1 in 1,000. At about 16%, we have all of the people who would score fairly high up on the checklist. And what criminologists will tell you is that this 16% represents the criminal class. These are people who, especially combined with low IQ, don't think twice about committing crime. It's not that they don't think they'll get caught, it's that they do not even consider it. They just impulsively act when they see an opportunity. So, big difference between psychopaths and serial killers. That is a common fallacy generated by a lack of understanding over the past 100 years of just how broad the sociopathology spectrum was. What is democracy's biggest problem? The biggest problem we've got is that the very worst type of human being to put in charge of the needs of the electorate, of the majority of people, is the one type who wants the job the most. We've got to try and keep them out rather than welcoming them in, because once they're in place, you can't shake them loose. And that type of individual knows that there is no more effective political tool to manipulate the masses than fear. And the difficulty we've got as a species is that we are wired for fear. Our behavior is genetically pre-programmed. It is instinctive, and it's designed to keep us alive. Our storytelling instincts remind us about historical disasters like the post-Ice Age flood, but we react to immediate threats like the Chinese virus, caravans of illegals coming to attack our borders, and terrorists. We are very responsive to triggers. If a group runs by us, we'll join them without asking what it is they're running from. A mere rumor can cause mass panic, as we've seen with buying toilet paper during the coronavirus panic. Something else we humans are wired for is wealth. Going back to this chart of social cooperation that builds tribal solidarity and back and forth, what underpins that, what undergirds our tribal nature, our human consciousness, due to self-preservation, is a strong desire to accumulate stuff. And with stuff, with wealth, we can buy power. On the empathy side of our consciousness, we have this desire to win influence by sharing. So you get wealth and you share it with the tribe. It wins you influence, better social cooperation, and everything works out just fine in a tribal situation. On the egotistical side, on the individual side, our drive to accumulate gets us into a position of being greedy and using that wealth that we accumulate to buy influence. If we give gifts to people within our tribe, it gives us a good reputation, and that's not a bad thing. So on a tribal basis, these two sides balance out pretty well. The problem is that when we gain wealth, it seems to actually change our behavior in a semi-permanent way. Take a look at these beautiful ladies. It looks to me like it's grandma on the right, mom on the left, and granddaughter in the middle. And clearly, you can see it in in the way that they're posed and on their faces. They are absolutely convinced that they are pretty darn special. So what seems to happen is that people with wealth come to believe that they truly are more deserving than their servants. They are special. The fact that they have been lucky, that they've had proximity to money, whether through their family or through the area that they live in, through the school that they ended up going to and making connections that had money, they will claim that it had zero part in their success. It seems to be something that actually ends up being a part of their wiring. They tend to forget their roots. You'll hear them say, the poor are stupid and lazy. The poverty trap is very real. There are brilliant, hardworking, smart people in the ghettos that cannot ever break out, no matter how hard they work or how smart they are, because once you are in the poverty trap, it's not easy to break out. The populace loves to watch royals and celebrities and wealth and power on parade. And the amazing thing to me is that they give them their wealth. You will hear the middle class say, oh yeah, we don't want to tax the rich. They should keep all their hard-earned money. And every time that we buy one of those celebrity magazines in the supermarket or watch entertainment television, we are pumping through advertising dollars into those celebrities' pockets and making them rich. Adulation and total isolation from the less moneyed reinforces the lie that the rich truly are special. And that's true of the poor people, the middle class, and the rich. All of them come to believe that because there is this separation, the rich, we don't really see them except in those magazines or on the television. And they don't see the poor people except for the servants who serve them. It's almost like if we have 3 square meals and a job, the majority accept subjugation quite quickly. Why? Are we so happy with simply projecting that no amount of inequity will make us rise up? Is that projection, can you imagine having all that money? Wow, it's so fantastic. Is that enough to just keep us quiet? The fact that we can watch them and use our imagination to think about how rich we could be? The slaves and the lower castes do appear to be okay with their lot in life. You see this in many countries where they've been subjugated forever. It seems like given sustenance and a little bit of purpose, like a job to do, we become complacent. And you'll hear the rich must know more than us, and therefore the boss must be special because they've got money and I don't. You'll hear, it could be worse. Why risk fighting for fairness? Maybe things will get even worse if we try fighting the inequity. It seems like only starvation, when we are like cornered rats, that we will actually stand up and fight inequity. And history tells us there's only one effective way to get rid of well-entrenched elites or dictators, and that is, sadly, armed insurrection. Or, as was the case after the Great Depression, the threat of it. Let's go back for a moment to what politics are we wired for this chart. I had pointed out that exile or elimination of self-centered individuals is normal for egalitarian tribes. And we had 6.99 million years of evolution that turned us into egalitarians. It was clearly what worked best for us. It was a survival technique. And it is still the case today. This was taken in 2016 by helicopter over the Amazon jungle of an uncontacted tribe. And these guys, they have exactly the same brain power as all of us do. If you leave a bunch of human beings out in the woods by themselves, this is as far as they will get in terms of cultural development. Crucial to my story today is what is wealth, first and foremost. We were egalitarian for millions of years, and suddenly we changed. Something happened to fuel that change. And I believe that it was wealth, which equals power, and this drive that is built into us to collect and hoard wealth. What is wealth? Is it money? Well, not really, because money is an invention. Whether it started with seashells and moved to gold and then to paper money, and now we've got digital money and credit cards. Certainly it was not that at the beginning. We see this change happening long before money started. Was it copper? Was it the discovery of copper and the value that it had as the first metal that human beings used? Again, we see the first evidence of problems that wealth creates starting before copper was discovered and smelting was invented. At its fundamental level, wealth is food, the ability to feed our tribe and a growing number of them, particularly food that you can accumulate. Wealth, as it increases, becomes the power to conquer. And what ultimately wins wars? For sure, there's strategy, there's tactics. Weapons are important to winning wars. The number of troops that you have is important. The training of the troops is important. The motivation of the troops is important. And certainly patience wins out if you're doing siege wars. But what is the ultimate thing that wins wars? It is whether or not you've got enough food either inside of your walls of your city-state that's being besieged or outside in order to keep the siege war going. The more food you've got, the more you are able to pay off your soldiers and go out and conquer new territory. I'm going to use this slide from my presentation number 17 just to remind everybody that it's tough to wrap our heads around how long we've been evolving. Between each of the snowflakes on this chart, which represent ice ages, they happen every 100,000 years on planet Earth, there are 5,000 generations of hominids. The periods in between are what Stephen Jay Gould brilliantly called punctuated equilibrium. We tend to have a massive die-off during an ice age, and the survivors who have an enhanced genetic makeup are the ones who then repopulate the planet. Evolution takes an incredibly long time. Not much of it has been happening in the last 7,000 to 12,000 years before the present that modern Homo sapiens have been living in static villages. And what clearly happened during the dawn of the power of wealth was that back in this period here, Homo sapiens, now modern Homo sapiens, having evolved away from archaic Homo sapiens, they figured out that if they could collect enough of this stuff, grain, they could store it over the winter, grind it into flour, and have a continuous food source even as things got cold. And suddenly, they no longer had to follow the herds. They could use this stuff and merely go out hunting for rabbits instead of following the herds. And sure enough, we see the very first evidence of a building being used in one single place to do something. And the archaeologists are saying, well, was this a religious building? Maybe. Certainly the development of more advanced religion was happening at this point because they're starting to worry about the seasons and the sun going up and down and whether or not there was going to be enough food for the next year. Could it have been storage? Well, definitely. It had to be storage. They've got all this grain. They've got to keep the rats and the mice out of it, and they've got to keep it dry. And they've got to do that for an entire winter. And to do that, you can't just use little stockpiles buried underground. You're going to have some kind of an organized storage system in place. Lastly, could it have been defense? Well, once you've got a grand storehouse filled with this great stuff that keeps you going for the winter, you've got a problem with all the marauding nomads nearby who are going to come in and try and take it. So it's obvious that this building had a defensive purpose, even if it was also religious. What came next? After the end of the Younger Dryas, that cold snap, we know that suddenly Homo sapiens figured it out. They figured out that if you planted these dry seeds in the springtime, you could grow your own foodstuffs and sustain a much larger population. And the religion that fueled the desire to construct the temples at Göbekli Tepe must have also been a way of bringing people together, having them talk about ideas, and figuring out how to be farmers. Farmers at this point start replacing hunter-gatherers all the way across Europe. What that says to me is that the type of personality trait that farmers have versus hunter-gatherers seems to be quite different, and so that may have affected the way that this new breed of people adopted or accepted new forms of political systems. Think about it. After 7 million years of hunting and gathering, suddenly we all had to stay in one place all year long, year after year. We had to work cooperatively with much larger social groups. It was very boring work, tilling, seeding, weeding, harvesting. It was a radically different diet, much more carbohydrates than meat suddenly. We had to defend not our territory, our hunting territory, or our tribe from other tribes or saber-toothed tigers. We were suddenly having to defend a place, our farm, and our stuff, our tools, and our grains, not territory or tribe. So that was a very different mindset. We had to invent a sun-based religion that aided in our solidarity and our hope for the new season to be better than the last. We had to expand to new territories to feed population growth on a regular basis. And suddenly we had to rely on strong leaders for organization and planning. So this was a significant change in our political situation. It was a radical, rapid transition. After almost 7 million years of exile or elimination of self-centered individuals, in just a couple of thousand years, we transitioned to relying on strong leaders for organization and planning. The door sprang open for self-centered autocrats to rise up. Suddenly, leadership, organization, and planning was important to us. Versus hunting and gathering, well-directed farming leads to a cascade of things happen. With good farming, we get rapid population growth. That leads to more task/job specialization. That leads to the women shifting from being equal participants to suddenly being stuck in the family compound, making clothing, milling grain into flour, and cooking. That leads to more leisure time for men, hanging out after they've done their farming, sitting around the campfire kind of thing. And for the women out there, that was it. That was the moment, or maybe it took several hundred years, but the moment that women got relegated to certain tasks was the moment that men could collectively start to suppress them and start to make up rules that allowed them sexual access to women and degrade women in general, putting them into second-class citizen status. And in a flash, after almost 7 million years of having an equal, egalitarian balance, men had women where they wanted them, stuck inside the family compound. And that leads to more improvements in technical skills in farming as they have more time to think about it, share ideas, and teach each other. That leads to non-perishable food surpluses and the storage of those surpluses. This leads to more organized religion, to rituals and temples being built. And that leads to community construction projects like making pyramids. So look at conquering dictators throughout history. All of these guys, and these are only the ones that we've got records of, all of these guys were self-proclaimed sons of God. Seriously, every single one. All of them seemed to understand at a fundamental level that they had to legitimize their reign through religious doctrine. Of course, it's backed up by enormous egos. It's that religious connection that they find so important. And it still exists today. Vladimir Putin is suddenly wearing a cross around his neck, claiming to be an adherent of the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't think so. Suddenly we've got egomaniacal, conquering dictators showing up in the historical record. If we look at this whole deal that we had going for many, many years with a good balance between ego and empathy in the tribe and everybody's happy, suddenly on the ego side, we've got this dude show up, the priest king to start with. Later on, he's just the king supported by priests, but it starts out most likely as a priest king. And we've got records of that we'll get to in a minute. And these guys can only become this conquering dictator if they have no empathy. Huge ego, no empathy. So instead of empathy, what they're doing is they're using the empathy of other people and manipulating them to do what they want. They're no longer sharing terms of winning influence with the entire tribe. They're sharing with their cronies. They're winning influence with only their cronies. They're not doing social cooperation. They're using autocracy. One guy at the top is making all the rules. And tribal solidarity goes out the window and gets transformed, manipulated into the tribal members becoming part of a war machine, soldiers. Their greed and their drive to accumulate buys influence through their war machine. It becomes a cycle that revolves around only this egomaniacal dictator. What makes these guys tick? Like, what gets them up in the morning? What makes them so damn determined? What fuels their endless drive to be on top? It's just incredible how driven they are compared to the rest of us. Why are they so paranoid all the time? How is it that they're relentlessly goal-focused? And if there was no source of wealth, would they still do what they do? I suspect they would try, but with the advent of farming, the sudden accumulation of wealth in terms of grains was the tipping point that opened the door for them. With narcissistic psychopaths, it is like they are addicted to their own behavior, to their own thoughts. And neurologists now understand better the roots of our addictions. They know that our brain does not get addicted to substances, but rather to repeating behaviors that trigger brain chemical rewards. Our brain does not get addicted to dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin, or endorphins themselves, but rather our brain does get addicted to the anticipation of reward chemicals being delivered obsessively. We can't stop obsessing once we get addicted to the idea of the next thrill coming our way. Our brain does get more sensitive, once addicted, to triggers for continuing with our addiction. Triggers like a McDonald's logo, if we're addicted to food, but it could be friends that we get high with on a regular basis, or the smell of alcohol or cocaine. So what motivates these characters, these wealth power hoarders? What's their motivation? Why the lifelong drive to accumulate ever more wealth? Why, when you've got billions of dollars more than you or your family can ever spend, why work every day to make even more? Why risk assassination on a daily basis to control more territory and control the country? It's not a job, folks. It's not even about them gaining more wealth and more power per se. What they are addicted to is the anticipation of winning every single day, going into the office and seeing another zero behind their accumulated wealth, seeing another country or area or region added to the map of their territory. What is up with their hyper-focus? Okay, so they're addicted to the idea of winning more and more wealth, power over and over, but don't they get bored of it after a few years? Nope, they never, ever tire of the game. It is a part of their brain wiring. They are addicted to acting upon their own thoughts. Every single time that they act out, their brain encourages them with a little squirt of reward chemicals into the reward center of their brain. They get patted on the back for following through on any given thought. Like Kim Jong-il deciding that his uncle is working against him. He gets the idea to not just kill him, but to blow him up with an anti-aircraft gun. Can you imagine the anticipation as he works towards making this happen? He's all excited and he's feeling really great about it. He goes ahead and does it, watches it happen, and he's like, whoa, this is fantastic. I feel so great. And then he can think about it every day afterwards and go, man, that was such a great idea. It made me so much more powerful. It won me so much respect, etc., etc. The hyperactive focus has something to do with a connection between OCD and ADHD. I don't know of anybody talking about this in the health field, but there seems to be a connection between these two things. Not all people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder have obsessive compulsive disorder, but all of the people with OCD have ADHD. It is what fuels their multitasking and their inability to let go of things they've become obsessed with. Narcissistic psychopathology appears to be highly correlated with OCD, ADHD. Whether their IQ is high or low, it means a dangerous combination for the rest of us when one of these guys tries to rise up in the ranks. Whether the narcissistic psychopath is not so smart or as clever as a fox, it still means bad news for the majority of people in their country. Let's face it, this guy has failed at every single thing he has ever attempted, and don't try and bullshit me into believing anything different. The reason he doesn't want to release his taxes is because he's broke, and he owes all of his money to the oligarchs in Russia. This guy has redefined accomplishing goals. Anything he set out to do, he's managed to pull off, including getting to be the president by what? Blowing up 4 apartment buildings. Actually, it was 5, 4 of them went off inside of Russia, killing a bunch of his innocent civilians in order to make an excuse to go into Georgia and attack the Chechens, look like a hero, and get elected president. Is that some wacky conspiracy theory? No, it's been pretty much proven beyond any shadow of a doubt. The other thing we are wired for is territoriality. We all have an instinctive reaction to strangers crossing an invisible line onto quote-unquote our property. Where does that come from? Well, it comes from being hunter-gatherers. Hunters knew where their territory began and ended, and if they found other people crossing that line, they had to defend their hunting territory. It's an instinctive and hardwired thing in our psyches. Some of our neighbors have hyper-vigilant wiring for territoriality. We all know that little old guy down the street who shouts, "Get off the lawn!" to the kids with the soccer balls. Dictators seem to become obsessed with maps and addicted to coloring in ever more territory on those maps. No matter how big their domain is, they never stop plotting the next murderous rampage. Just take a look at Alexander the Great. I mean, him and his boys, right? Getting up every morning, getting on the horses and going off to conquer more territory. There's a part of the map I haven't colored in yet. It's like there's a program in their brains. It's very consistent with every single one of these narcissistic psychopaths. Number one, they buy or murder or manipulate or bullshit their way to the top. They then promise to pay anyone who supports them generously. They take over all messaging, the media, especially important, the pulpits, the religious backing that they get from priests, etc., and the public squares. They then ensure through payments, through the distribution of wealth to the church and or the military, that they're going to back them up. They take over control of policing and the court system. They lock up, assassinate, and threaten all of the opposition into silence. They take absolute control of all the taxes and natural resource profits. They go to war to get even more money, more slaves, and more territory. They then build palaces and monuments to celebrate their power, and they then pass on their wealth to their genetic copies. They've been doing it for generations. None of these people fought to get to their position. They all inherited their positions. Makes you wonder why the heck we're still paying for them all. And all of these people are interrelated in some way, so there's a lot of incestuous connections going on there. It's like the narcissistic psychopath dictator arrives pre-programmed. They don't have to read a book. They don't require any advisors. They don't need to figure it out over time. Once they pry the door open, it all just comes naturally to them. The totalitarian program comes genetically pre-wired into the brains of narcissistic psychopaths. And that program never stops running as long as they can draw breath. Looking back at the hockey stick of our IQ evolution, our technological advances, at the benchmarks, out of all of these benchmarks, it's amazing to me that this first group from 1 through 11, it took almost 7 million years for that list to be developed. It was not until 15 to 12,000 years before the present that we start to see Homo sapiens starting to do farming, figuring out how to make beer and wine, and we know that they were egalitarian at that point. What's fascinating to me is that it took all of this time, up until number 23, for narcissistic psychopath dictators to start showing up in the archaeological record at 5,000 years before present. I mean, they must have existed before that, and this was only recorded history of them, but it did take a long time for them to show up. We were egalitarian up till here. The copper era started off at 9,000 years before the present as egalitarian, but eventually changed. What radically changed our human situation was this. Once we started to get city-states at 7,000 years before the present, we start seeing conflict, and we start seeing a new invention, which is slavery. And once we figured out slavery, there was no stopping conquering dictators from taking over and doing what they do best, conquering. How was it that we suddenly got to city-states in our record? To understand that, we have to look at Dunbar's number. That's the cognitive limit that Mr. Dunbar figured out of how many people we can maintain stable, egalitarian relationships with. Neocortex size and capacity limits our ability to keep track of interrelations. Whose kids are whose, who was the mom versus who was the dad, and how have their relationships changed? What are each individual tribe member's likes, dislikes, etc.? That's a heck of a lot of data. Everyone in the tribe knows who each person is and how each person relates to every other person. Once you get beyond that, things start to fall apart because larger populations require more restrictive rules, laws, and enforced norms to maintain stable, cohesive groups. At first, religious rules solve that problem. Once we started to grow beyond Dunbar's numbers, and these circles represent population sizes, at 5 people, that's more or less the size of a home, nuclear family. At 15, you've got a family compound with grandma, grandpa, and aunts and uncles living inside the compound. At 50, you've got a little hamlet with 3, 4, 5 family compounds in it. And at 150, you've got a village. Once you get to 500, you're looking at a town, and 1500, you're looking at a small city for the purposes of my example here. But 150 is Dunbar's number. It might be higher or lower. The point is that that's about the limit that our brain power can handle to keep track of all those relationships. Once we grow beyond 1500, we're at a size of the city-state at 200,000. That is an interrelationship situation that evolution never prepared us for. At 15 to 50 people, we're talking about the successful size of a hunter-gatherer tribe. At 150, we're talking about interrelated tribes that all know each other by name and know all their history. And that's where we were for almost 7 million years, egalitarian. For the last 7,000 years, suddenly our norm has been dictatorships. There was a shift from us being egalitarian tribal members to becoming fodder for the tyrants to send into battle. We started out at 150. Our size was ideal, we know, for social cooperation, tribal solidarity in our newly large human brains to work out just fine for millions of years. The wedge that we had at that size between us and the next tribe, the next village, was fear of not of our tribe. Once we grew beyond that to like 500 individuals, we needed something new in terms of a political system to keep us tight, to keep us together without conflict within our group. And that was religion. We went from a village to a congregation of 500 people. And then the wedge between us and the next congregation was death to believers and other gods. What underpinned all of that was a feeling of tribalism, an innate feeling that these people are our people. And tribalism really is a survival mechanism. It is simply prejudice against, quote unquote, the other. Fear of not of our tribe is a natural human instinct related to our hypervigilant agent detector brain wiring, which is the instinct that we've got if we see a shadow in the nighttime to assume it's something that's coming to kill us. If we see rustling in the grasses, it might be a saber-toothed tiger. We better turn and run. Especially if we're all on our own. As a tribe, we can defend ourselves against saber-toothed tigers or the other tribe, but all by ourselves, not so much. Walking down a dark path and encountering someone not of our tribe triggers a natural hypervigilant reaction. It's normal. Genetic hardwiring means that that thing can never be eradicated. Tribalism can be reduced, but it can never entirely be eliminated, no matter what the woke people on the far left will try and convince you of. Once we grew from 500 people in a town to 1,500 people in a city, something magical and maybe not so great happened to tribalism. It seems that it transforms at that point into a feeling of nationalism, a love of our nation, this group that we don't know all the members of. We had the wedge of fear of not of our tribe. We had death to believers in other gods, keeping our congregations apart. Once we get nationalism, we get this new wedge that is, you're not of our tribe or of our gods, we must kill you. Once we got to the size of a city-state, 200,000 people, suddenly populist autocratic dictators drop into place. People with low education and little familiarization with others are enthusiastic supporters of populists. We can see this in the politics around us today. Those populists then lead those supporters into battle against the other. Those tribal members become very enthusiastic soldiers. In fact, we love belonging to a tribe. We will self-identify as tribe members over dogs versus cats in coffee shops when they put the two cups out and they put tips for dog lovers, tips for cat lovers. Boom, they see the tips double and triple in size. We reject facts/truth to adopt any cultural story in order to become and remain tribe members. That's what religions are. That's all they are. They are just inventions of either one guy or a group, and everybody gloms onto them, and then they go, yay, this is now what we're all about. That's a part of our human wiring. Our wiring for feeling offended is hair-triggered, yet none of us can describe what that feeling is exactly. I mean, what is it? I feel offended. Your feelings are hurt. Basically, that's what it is. You're trying to tell me you're smarter than I am, and that makes you angry, and so angry that you're ready to go to war. Incredible. Dying, killing for our tribal identity comes very naturally to us. We enjoy it, apparently. We seem to get a thrill out of it. For many, the leader becomes their religion. It's incredible that this guy will rise up and suddenly all the minions are like, oh, bowing down, he's the son of God. Incredible. Suddenly any sacrifice is okay to these supporters. They will die in order to build him a pyramid or in some stupid territorial war that he's invented, or they'll offer up their kids as sacrifices because he's deemed it to be the right thing to do. The question is then, why don't we eliminate and exile these narcissistic psychopaths like we used to do? Well, it seems like 7,000 years of autocratic success points to something in our genetic wiring, in our psychology, that leads us to continue to support these guys no matter what they do to us. Psychologically, fear of torture or death or that of family members plays a role in acquiescence, to be sure. Pure laziness plays a huge role. Well, things are okay. Let's not bother going to the effort of trying to change things. Keep in mind that 84% of our population just isn't very smart, and different populations have different average IQs. Some are not so smart at all. Some genetic groups are smarter than others. You will hear the not so smarters say, but we can't figure it out without him, our fearless leader. Another factor is societal pressure. Many generations are spent being lower cased, and there's pressure from both those above and the caste itself to say, we got to stick within our little group. But I think an even more telling thing that happens deep within our brains is that we now know that once a loser gets conquered, they produce, in males, less serotonin and testosterone, while the winners produce much more. So you've got the people at the top who are feeling pretty good and charged up about things, whereas those at the bottom are quite literally feeling like losers, like they belong where they are. Plus, once the narcissistic psychopaths become self-anointed god kings, there's very little that can be done as a society to push them out. Now here's another button that is built into our hardwiring. What does this big red button say? It says, joyfully march to our deaths. We've apparently, as a herd, got this wired into us. And basically, you can check one or both boxes. You can check the box for country, I will joyfully march to my death, or for God, or for both, for God and country, as they used to say in Britain. What flabbergasts me is that what seems to also be in our wiring is that not only will we go to march off to our deaths quite happily for God, we'll do it for a God king, some guy who just declares himself to be in charge and to be the guy who knows everything and everyone has to follow. And we know that there are people out there who would do it for these guys. 16-year-olds who would lie about their age in order to sign up for the draft and go off to war just because one of these two characters suddenly came up with a great idea, like Putin has. In Crimea, there was no lives lost, but that's not the case in eastern Ukraine, sadly. They ran out of body bags, I think, at one point. There is something in our wiring that encourages us to march off to our deaths in war so readily at the behest of these narcissistic psychopaths. Hear people say it. You'll hear the soldiers say it. You'll hear all the guys who do paragliding and ice climbing and mountain climbing. They all say, it won't happen to me. Just before the bad shit happened. Why do they believe it won't happen to them? Because down deep in their heart of hearts, they really do believe that it won't happen to me because I'm just so darn special. It's that in combination with our propensity for addiction. So many men just can't resist the thrill that comes from facing near certain death, that adrenaline rush, and they look forward to it. The armies of old told their leaders they were willing to go back into battle again, standing at the edge of the cliff with the hang glider behind you. It's a primarily male phenomenon, but it seems like many of us just cannot say no to that thrill. This is modern Homo sapiens' most destructive trigger. And I figured this out in speaking with my wife, who had lived in Israel for a time, although she's not Jewish, and she has very strong feelings about Israel versus the Palestinians, whereas I feel the opposite. She said, no, you got to understand that what you're saying to me is that you're right and I'm wrong, that you're smart and I'm stupid. And I realized that's true. Anywhere in the world where there are these kinds of conflicts, this is the trigger. Are you telling me that what your tribe believes is the truth and mine is not? That my truth is stupid and yours is smart? What's the natural next thing that anybody who feels this way says? I have to kill you. Incredible, but true. So despite my having toyed with the idea that offense is not a real thing, that it's some kind of a vague thing, I now realize, with some embarrassment, that it's not. It is a very real thing, and it seems to be wired into human brains, especially the not-so-smarters out there, especially the not-so-smarters who are also conservatively wired, that 30% of our global population. Psychopathology has nothing to do with ethnicity, with culture, or with religion. 20th century populist dictators around the globe prove that out. No matter where we are, there are narcissistic psychopaths who are running things. It's just human nature at its nastiest. Even today, 2020, our new all-male normal looks like this. In all the countries around the world, there are an incredibly large number of dictatorships. In countries like Mexico, 18 rich families have controlled the country for decades. In America, it's basically now an oligopoly. Once the bought and paid for Supreme Court passed Citizens United, they allowed the rich to purchase politicians at will. The so-called PACs are not controlled by anybody other than the politician themselves. They can spend that money any way they want. Nobody tracks it. And so the rich run America now with virtually no barriers. There is no real democracy. And that's true of most Western countries. It's just what comes naturally out of capitalism. There are the familiar characters you're aware of. However, on top of these guys, there is an enormous number of dictators all around the world running things that we don't really pay much attention to. But that's the new normal today, and there's no women among them. It's a male thing. The fact is that our new normal simply isn't normal. For all of our existence, we were happy egalitarians sharing the burden of trying to make decisions on what the tribe should do next. This is our new normal, but it is not what comes most naturally to our brain wiring. Why do we, especially the conservatives among us, seem to revere these people, treat them like heroes, the business owners that we call captains of industry, the dear leader dictators? And here's a question for you. If you live anywhere in the Muslim world and you are a narcissistic psychopath, there's nothing you want more than to be up on stage in front of a large group of people that are adoring you, and you can dictate to them, and all you need is legitimacy. All you need is a book that you can turn to, and that book will give you absolute power to demand that these people do all kinds of stuff that really is not very good for your fellow human beings. I mean, it was started by a warlord who wanted to get his own way and have sex with as many women as he could, etc., etc. All you have to do to become an imam is memorize the Quran, which if you've got a high crystallized IQ, which many narcissistic psychopaths do, you can do. And once you've memorized it, there's no head office. There's no one controlling what you can say or do. You can just make your fatwas at will. You are not in an association of imams. You are your own boss in your own mosque. Fantastic. What a great system. And we're told that we can't in any way criticize this, whether by accident or by design. It is a deeply flawed setup that encourages the worst kinds of human beings to take the reins and become the bosses. The billionaires that we look up to, military hawks and famous wartime generals, royalty and CEOs. Are they heroes, or are they just regular people like the rest of us who got really lucky or are super driven to force themselves into those roles? Well, in part, I think it's because hope springs eternal in the human heart. Hope is irrational, and so is projection, which, when you think about it, is simply narcissism. We think, imagine how great it is to have all that money and control. Or if I had his job, I'd do all the same things as he does. And nobody else can do what he does because he told us so. I'm just some guy, but he makes me feel like a somebody. And between the sexes, the men imagine, well, that could be me up there. While the women imagine, that could be me up there, the first lady. And I think that there is this pure joy that comes out of human voyeurism that we find difficult to shut off and say no to. We think, they're so rich and beautiful, I could just watch them all day long. We watch them on e-entertainment television. We watch them on YouTube. We watch all the awards ceremonies and buy all the magazines in the grocery store checkout line. For millennia, we have had autocratic populist dictators. Here are some of the benefits for voters who are hardwired to hate any kind of change and who struggle with complexity, the not-so-smarters. Is your life full of challenges? He'll fix them for you. Do you struggle to figure out what's true and what's not? Kill fake news journalists. Richer people make you jealous? He'll take all their money away from them. Are decisions tough to make? He'll make all the decisions. Do you feel like you should be special? He'll assure you that you are. Want riches and women? Take them from those other people. Do you get creeped out by people who look or act differently than your tribe does? No problem. He'll get rid of them for you. And if you are angry at smart, educated people, he'll just enslave them, put them into a gulag. For hardwired conservatives, autocratic dictators are the easy button. There's no need to analyze any more in your life. He makes you feel good. Law and order, lock 'em up. He repeats what your brain assures you is right. Back to the good old days. Buy guns and ammo, kill those others, those not of our tribe. And during the coronavirus, there has been a run on guns and ammunition. I want you to think twice about what that means. Those not-so-smarters piling up stockpiles in their basement. No matter how badly autocrats handle a crisis, the more fear will grip a growing majority of people, and the more the autocrats' support will grow, no matter if they're not so smart or clever as a fox. Our collective fear of having no leadership in a crisis far outweighs our desire for having kind and fair leaders. Crises can be a threat to autocrats or huge opportunities to consolidate and increase their power. Donald Trump has screwed up this coronavirus crisis in the US worse than it could even possibly be imagined. And yet his support has gone from low 30s to 55 last time I checked, and it'll probably go higher. Makes you wonder, 55% of the entire population has got an IQ of under 103, since 84% have an IQ lower than 115. Trump is using his abysmally failed leadership regarding the COVID-19 virus pandemic as a re-election gambit recently. And Hungary now has a new dictator, as Orban has pushed through legislation that will give him virtually unlimited power forever, just like Xi in China. Intuition, remember, informs religion. And we now know that religion is hardwired into our brains. We will invent religion wherever we show up around the world spontaneously. It's just something that humans do. It's in our wiring to do so. That self-preservation instinct that we've got leads us down this tribalism route. And what that's about, remember, is conservatism, but not fixing what isn't broke. There are the 30% that are hardwired to believe and feel in their heart of hearts that any conservative position is always the right one. There are the 30% that are hardwired for progressive thinking. And then there's the 40% in the middle. Those 40%, as I said earlier, those are the ones who decide democratic elections. Who is it that is going to support, first and foremost, autocratic dictators whenever the opportunity arises to elect one or to put one in power? It's going to be these people on the left side of this chart, what I'm calling the red-colored not-so-smarters, the conservative not-so-smarters. And they're going to enthusiastically embrace a populist because he's saying everything that they like. He's repeating everything that they think is the right way to go. And as long as you've got someone who's controlling the police and the judiciary, that individual is going to be able to keep control of the rest of the population. But it should be pointed out that tyrants don't really need a very big base to maintain their power. In every nation that they own, the same neo-Nazi nationalist segment of the population is sufficient, and that base can be white or black, brown or Asian. It's a racially diverse, ultra-conservative, hardwired fringe group that tends to be able to make enough noise and generate enough fear of what they might do to keep these guys in power. These young guys, between the ages of like 16 and 26, are in the prime of their life, and they're hormonally supercharged. They will kill for their dear leader with very little provocation. We've seen them come out of the woodwork after Trump was elected. You can call them fascist thugs or terrorists, but they're ideologically blank. They're just wired for obedience and mayhem. You see them in the news all around the world. It doesn't matter the race, it doesn't matter what continent they're on. They all come out of the woodwork in Zimbabwe, in Israel, in America, in China, in India, and in Russia, and in every other country of the world. There is a fringe group like these guys within the population that is ready to rock and roll the moment you push that button. And it doesn't seem to matter whether the ideology that they have latched onto is Islam or Hinduism or taking land back from white people or white supremacy. As long as there's an element of nationalism in it, these young fellows will more than happily pick up arms and go to battle over it. The ideology has to be conservative, however. The idea that the left is far more prone to violence than the right doesn't bear out in all of these examples from around the world. We have to ask ourselves, these guys have been around forever. At a small percentage of the population, you saw that even the chimps end up having tyrants within their group. Is it an accident of complexity? Of the human brain getting so smart? Clearly not, because even the chimps have this problem. So It seems like it must be a beneficial mutation. That's a shot from American Psycho. It's only 1% of our human population around the world, but it seems that it must have been beneficial in our past. From the lists and the charts that I've shown you, ever since wealth came to be, narcissistic psychopaths have dominated the world. You may be wondering what my conclusion is. I believe that they are Homo sapiens' secret weapon. Let's go through my rationale. Once farmers replaced hunter-gatherers, different personality type, and once villages turned into cities, and once medicine men became the high priests in the congregation, and then once civic leaders took over with the priests' support, then narcissistic psychopaths stepped in. They stepped in to rally those conservatives that are on that left side of the bell curve. They dragged in the centrists. They overwhelmed the progressives, and they began to dictate. They became a necessary evil to do battle with each other, the other narcissistic psychopaths who had taken over the city-states nearby. And in so doing, they would protect the rest of us. This became our new normal and continues through to today. How many narcissistic psychopaths are in your life? 1 in 100 seems like they're rare, but actually they're all around us because they're very aggressive at stepping up into high-profile positions. Here's a few things to look for to figure out whether or not you've got a narcissistic psychopath in your life, and you probably have way more than one because you've run into more than 100 people. Number one, whatever you think or do is wrong. Their thoughts are perfect. You're always in the wrong. Number two, everyone is plotting against them. Neighbors up to something. Number three, their angry outbursts at personal slights are legendary. And number four, as are their tearful claims that they've been treated unfairly. Number five, everything, without exception, is about its effect on them, no matter what it is, no matter what it has to do with anything else in the world, has nothing to do with them. They will see it as being about how it's either positively or negatively affecting them. They screw people over whenever the opportunity arises. They cannot help themselves. It's just that criminal instinct. When there's an opportunity to do something that is not right, they can't help it. They can't resist it. They'll do the criminal thing. Just look at Nixon. They have no real friends, just hangers-on. And of course, they're genetic copies who can't go anywhere. They are rigidly into routines and they hate change. You must know people who have these kinds of traits. They're around. There is nothing wrong with them, lastly. The fault is all yours. And anytime you try to point anything out, you're just going to get gaslighted. You're going to get sidetracked because they're going to turn it back on you. They have zero empathy. Narcissistic psychopaths, you have to understand, you have to wrap your head around this, because I've seen people go, oh, well, you have to point it out to them. You have to bring it up with them every time they do something weird. You've got to say it. No, you're off track. They cannot be fixed because others' suffering is inconsequential to them. They don't have any empathy. They can't wrap their heads around what you're talking about. They see their dominance, control, manipulation, and lying as normal, even beneficial. You'll hear them say, my wife needs a good beating. These guys are the wife beaters out there. The narcissistic psychopaths who become powerful are truly dangerous. They are inherently ruthless human beings who have no problem sacrificing their citizens' lives to benefit themselves and achieve their obsessive brain's goals. Given free rein, they'll immediately invoke the Totalitarian Program to cement their positions and move forward relentlessly. I need to go back to this chart for a moment again. What politics are we wired for? We know that 6.99 million years of evolution turned us into egalitarians. And you got to ask yourself, okay, so that's a long time for us to have been egalitarians. What then is an egalitarian political system? Democracy is an egalitarian political system. Democracy means everyone. So most of us are wired for being democratic, the majority of us. A small percentage, 1%, are wired for being dictators. They are the narcissistic psychopaths. Another 1 to 2% are wired to be their cronies. Those are the sociopaths. But there's another 30% that seem to be wired for subjugation. Yay, autocratic dictators, we want you, you hear them chanting. Which political system offers what's best for the majority? Well, we kind of have figured this out over the last 100 years. What works best for the majority is a balance of greed and giving. And I call that system democratic social capitalism. Capitalism light finally gave China's economy wings after decades of trying the communist experiment that didn't work. Democratic social capitalism has made the Nordic countries happy and prosperous. And you could say the same thing for Canada, Germany, and many other Western countries like Australia. America actually became truly unique due to the New Deal, which was an entirely socialist program. And it's only once that came in that America became the destination for so many people that wanted freedom and the possibility to start a great life. Not just because they had the political freedom to work hard within a capitalist system, but because they knew that America provided the social welfare that was necessary for so many people to get a leg up. We know now that nations suppressing inequality through redistribution benefit the majority of their citizens most. On the other hand, every time that self-interest wins, the masses suffer. And that has been proven over and over and over again, no matter whether you look at bastardized socialist systems that existed in the Soviet Union and China, or bastardized capitalist systems that have been taken over by demagogues the world over. I need to take you back again to this slide as well. What cultural behaviors maintain the egalitarian balance in a hunter-gatherer tribe? Number one, females must be totally equal contributors. That was the case for almost 7 million years of our existence on the planet. Children bring each other up in the tribal creche without interference or discipline from parents. Number three, adult social play identifies capabilities and promotes self-handicapping, thus reducing dominance and building trust. Everybody knows who's good at what, but they also know that they can trust each other to use their skills when the time comes the tribe needs them, but at other times play them down. And lastly, the practice of reverse dominance prevents narcissistic psychopaths from rising to dictatorship. They ridicule egoists on a daily basis, and if they cannot get them to act in a fair and kind manner, they exile them, and if they can't exile them, they eliminate them. And the anthropologists will tell you that they have tracked this exact kind of thing going on in South Pacific Islands, where exile of the individuals is not possible. They'll all get together, have a little vote, and sneak up on the dude in the middle of the night and slit his throat. Problem solved. But we live in a different world, a different reality today, a new normal. So what's a species to do? I have a simple 3-step plan to protect democracies, prevent pointless wars, and fight catastrophic inequality of the type that we have in 2020. Number one, globally, psychopaths need to be identified in childhood, given special training and social norms, and we know that they memorize that kind of thing really well. They're very curious about it at an early age, and they need to be tracked throughout their lives, just like sexual predators are. They are the high school bullies, the angry antisocial loners, the childhood con men, and the cruel manipulative prima donnas. And don't tell me that you think Tom Cruise is so sweet and he couldn't possibly be a narcissistic psychopath. He is the most clear example in the entire entertainment industry. He has used his money in the Scientology church to rise up to a top position. And Scientology is a completely made-up cult created by a science fiction writer, L. Ron Hubbard, who famously said, if you want to get really rich, invent a religion. And number two in our 3-step plan is that the empathetic majority needs to legislate limits on the rise of these identified narcissistic psychopaths and any others that we happen to come across in religions, in corporations, and in governments. We have to just say no to narcissistic psychopaths. Yes, they're only 1% of the population, but they are 100% self-interested and will never do the right thing for the majority. By this point in my presentation, I think you get that our new normal simply isn't normal. For almost 7 million years, we were egalitarian. Women had an equal role in society. All decisions were made by the entire tribe. And now this is our new normal. There is not a single woman in that crowd, nor any black guys. There's just Donnie in the middle demanding loyalty from these poor sycophants that have to suck up to him in the Republican Party. And to accuse them of being morally bankrupt, while it may be true for many, the type of person who goes into politics, after all, tends not to be the most empathetic and ethically uncompromised individual. These guys are trapped in a system whereby they must keep the dummies out there who vote for them happy with bumper sticker solutions for extremely complex problems that will never be solved with a bumper sticker solution, while at the same time giving tax breaks and everything else that their donor class wants, while the donors funnel unlimited amounts of money into their bank accounts through super PACs. If they don't keep both sides happy, they won't stay in office, and that seems to be the one thing that they want to do most. Essentially, America's democracy is fatally broken and won't be fixed until Citizens United is reversed. But I haven't been entirely fair to the conservatives out there, because the reality is there are just as many not-so-smarters on the left as there are on the right. The slide I presented much earlier about conservatism versus progressivism said science informs truth just as intuition informs religion. It is the fact that modern Homo sapiens ended up with such a high intellect, such a well-developed brain, and had so much higher IQ that they could start to innovate, to change, and to adapt to any situation they found themselves in. And that was the root of progressivism moving forward. For almost 2 million years, Homo erectus didn't change very much. Then along came archaic Homo sapiens and basically wiped them out. Out of the middle of the last ice age, at 65,000 years ago, modern Homo sapiens emerged, tromped across Eurasia and into Europe between 45 and 35,000 years ago, and wiped out the last of the Neanderthals. Why? Because exterminating other species and tribes is something we do really well. So progressivism became a huge advantage for modern Homo sapiens. It meant that we could live in any environment and survive and thrive, increase our population even in difficult times. So this group of not-so-smarters has brought in all kinds of stuff in America and in many democracies around the world. A lot of it seemed really clever at the time. It has proven to be disastrous, and they can't wrap their heads around the fact that it has proved to be a failure and has to be reversed. So this group of hardwired progressives that are not so smart are easily conned by populist dictators who spout the same kind of bullshit to them that they do to people on the right. And that wins over these dummies. They're like, oh, okay, he sounds pretty good. Let's vote for him. And so you get the blue not-so-smarters also going along with the populist dictator, who now, with his guns and his control of the police and the judiciary and the military, controls the very smart people in the middle, the 40% who are not left or right, and pose a real threat to his regime. You may have picked up on the fact that I did not say what the third step in my 3-step plan is. Let me add to the list. In order to protect democratic social capitalism, the only system, political system around the world that we know actually works best for the majority rather than just for the upper crust, is to identify narcissistic psychopaths early, train them in social norms, and track them throughout their lives. Number 2, legislate limits on their rise in religions, in governments, organizations, and corporations around the world. And number 3, deplatform the woke movement and bring a permanent end to political correctness. I still think that in the modern world, feeling offended should not be a real thing. We have grown past it. We are way too smart, and we've gone way too far down this road of democratic social capitalism to allow feeling offended to be a real thing in our societies. We must crush it and push it down and say, there's no such thing as feeling offended. What, you feel bad? Tough luck. That's the way life is. If you enjoyed this thought piece of mine today, despite the fact it's quite long and has a lot packed into it, and you think that your school, your company, your organization would get something out of a seminar like this, I do customized perspective-changing seminars and content for all different types of groups. And given the coronavirus scare, I don't have to do these things in person. I can do them for small groups or large groups over a GoToMeeting or any other platform that your organization uses. Just contact me at justonecynicsopinion@gmail.com. I hope you got something out of my thinking, and if you think I deserve it, please click on the thumbs up sign down below. If you'd like to watch more of my insights into what drives our sometimes peculiar behavior, please click on the links beside me to other videos I've posted. To get notified when I put something new out, click on the subscribe link below me. If you feel inclined to really help me out, do all of the above, as it helps my ranking on YouTube go up.